and this desperation you feel because, rather than raising a child up to live, you're sort of, raising a parent unto death. And it is the same dedication, though, to care and meticulousness of care and ensuring they eat every day and they get their medications on time and they're able to sleep. And I think that psychologically, it feels like a part of yourself is dying when you see them suffering and uncertain and scared and calling for their parents, because you are the parent essentially.
This ain't your average healing chat. It's healing through conversations with me, Lovely Brown. Real talk, deep healing, zero fluff.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Healing Through Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Lovely, and today we're going to be exploring part 2 of Miss Rachel Waters' story. If you haven't paid attention to part 1, we want you to go back and listen for context so that you fully understand where we are in the story. It really sets the emotional foundation for what we're going to be diving into today. And what we're going to be talking about today is really it's the post and pre all at the same time of how Miss Waters has and had to fight for her freedom, fight for her name, fight for her reputation, fight for her mother's legacy. And I want us to understand that when you're fighting for your truth and other people start to lie, evidence matters so much more than anything else. So, Rachel, take us back to the night that you found out there was a possibility you could be charged for murder of your mom, for the murder of your mom.
So, it's funny. It actually starts a few days prior. And I think that is where the buildup is the most critical, because my mom had been living at a memory care facility for about 4 months. And she was continuing to progress with her cancer, which she had come out of remission in early December of 2022. And then she went into hospice because multiple myeloma, when you have run out of the treatment options, it will continue to progress and create bone lesions. And that also accelerated her Alzheimer's more toward the end stage as well. And so by the time she was in the memory care facility, she had already been on home hospice. And when people are put on home hospice, family caregivers across the country are provided with something called a comfort care kit. It's also known as an emergency or e-kit. And this will contain medications like sublingual morphine, lorazepam, suppositories for constipation. And these are designed to ease distress and pain at end of life, especially if there isn't a hospice care provider available to administer them. And when they're prescribed to you, you're trained on how to use them. You're told what to expect, and you kind of don't really think anything of it because that is just how it's done. And so when my mom went into the memory care facility, we still had the hospice care comfort kit. It was just a different residence, right? And the
Mhm.
assumption was that she would probably also have one in the facility. But at that point, it wasn't really our business as much, right? Because there are also some certified nursing assistants that work in memory care facilities that hopefully can take over for you in times of need. So my mom, she continued to decline while she was in memory care. But on July 9th of 2023, I get an urgent call from hospice that my mom has been found doubled over and non-responsive at her memory care facility with an oxygen saturation in the 70s, and she had been declared imminently dying.
Mm.
And imminently dying is considered medically irreversible, right? Her fingers and toes were already turning black and blue, and they documented this. And they said to me, "You have literally hours, possibly days, to get down here um, before she dies." And so immediately, my husband David and I jumped into action. We had to book a train to DC and then a flight from there because a huge storm had taken out any chance of flying out of New York.
Mm.
We finally get down on the 10th. We set up shop in my mom's room at the memory care facility because we had at least enough room for an air mattress, and we wanted to be there every moment to ensure that I was able to not just monitor her care, but that she didn't die, while we were away because she had no food, no fluids. And when we got there, she wasn't responding to anything. She was essentially paralyzed. Her eyes were open most of the time. They were already drying out from the lack of fluids,
Mm.
right? Because her advance directive stated that she didn't want anything other than comfort measures. And something like fluids is a more life sustaining measure.
Mhm.
Um, that's really hard to see, and nothing really prepares you for what your loved one looks like when they're, actively dying.
Mm.
But one of the things we noted was every time she was turned, she would really grimace in agony. And I asked the facility as well as hospice, like, oh, hey, does she have morphine here, like for PRN, or that is like as needed basis, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, because I knew that was the standard of care, and they said no. And that immediately set off a lot of red flags. Now, I knew we had this comfort care kit in the event she started dying, but I didn't want to have to rely on that, right? I
Yeah.
wanted to be sure she had this comfort medication. My husband went ahead and picked up the comfort care kit from the house, kept it in our car so it couldn't be accessed by anyone in the facility. And again, you're not really thinking anything of it because this is what your training was. It's like, hey, if someone's about to die, you need to have it close at hand. And so my mom continued to progress toward death for several days, for 2 days. And as she's progressing, I'm having interactions with hospice where I am demanding morphine because she is in clear agony when she's turned. She also had two large pressure sores
Mhm.
on her back and backside. And those are also incredibly painful, plus bone cancer.
Yeah.
Um, and so when we awoke the morning of July 12th, 2023. The thing that woke me up, at least, was actually the sound of teeth smashing against each other. And that's the agonal breathing when the only thing that works is the jaw. And so,
Mhm.
in an effort to get air, they will smash their teeth together. And that is exactly what morphine is prescribed for, in addition to pain. And at that point, I contacted folks at the front desk in the facility to see if there was any morphine yet, because this had been denied repeatedly by hospice, and didn't know why at the time. Um, and they said, no, we don't have anything. I said, well, I do have a comfort care kit, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call hospice to get guidance on that. And so this is where the stories between, hospice and I diverge. Although it's all agreed that I called hospice for guidance.
Mhm.
But, you know, after I got what I believed was the guidance to use it, which there's no law, by the way, that we're aware of that requires any authorization after you've been trained on use. I'm just overly cautious,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. When you're talking about the gap in
Yes.
education versus application.
Yeah, and I knew it was a critical moment because my worst nightmare would have been to make her suffering worse. And morphine is one of those drugs where, she was already opioid tolerant. She had a fentanyl patch for her cancer pain, but it was not going to be enough. So you want to be very conservative and thoughtful because death by a morphine overdose is a really terrible way to die. And
Mm.
you don't even want to make that accidental. So you use a very conservative dose, which is what is recommended on the bottle. And my mom, she only received one dose, which was, the correct dose to give for agonal breathing. And it didn't really make a difference at all. She passed anyway. And we didn't think anything of it because that is what we were trained and what, I was trained to do. And it was my understanding, like, oh, surely this is protected, right? Because families do this all the time.
Yeah.
And I had no idea anything was coming because hospice came and dressed her. They bathed, they cleaned her up. So you don't really it doesn't seem like a crime scene, right?
Yeah, where they taking away evidence or coming
Right,
in.
right,
Yeah.
and no one was acting unusual in that sense, and they came and declared her, and then, a few hours later, we had been waiting a little while for the funeral home to come and pick her up. My mom had always wanted a cremation. We had been in contact with the funeral home for several days since we had been told she was dying, to see, like, what kinda days were available for a funeral, what the schedule looked like. Um and so they were expecting it as well. They came, they said, "Hey, we're gonna be a little late. Why don't you go ahead and go home, and we'll let you know when we picked her up." And on the way home, at this point, my other husband, Chet, had flown in. His flight was also delayed because of all the storms. So all of us are in the car, and I get a call from the funeral home, and they said, "There's been a problem. We can't pick up your mom's body. It's being taken to Atlanta for an investigation." And that was the moment I knew that that was surely a murder investigation, because why else
Would you want to keep the body?
would they take the body?
Mhm.
And in that moment, all of the grief I felt just flipped the switch to, "Oh my god, I have to fight for my life now. I am suddenly in survival mode, and I don't know why it's happened or how it's happened, but it's real, clearly. I'm not hallucinating this phone call, and
Yeah.
I need to start figuring out what to do next." And so the first thing I did was, Google an attorney that would specialize in a potential murder charge, which
Yeah.
felt extremely surreal, but I found an attorney, and he said, "Your instinct is right. There probably is a murder investigation, and it could be felony murder, it could be manslaughter, it could be anything." I'm like also Googling felony murder in Georgia because, of course, only a few states have felony murder. I'm like, well, I didn't commit a felony, so it's
Yeah.
not bad. I was like, I didn't commit any crime that I know of. Tell him what, has happened. And he said, regardless, you have to prepare because, law enforcement's going to make contact with you and they're going to want to question you. And I knew, I used to work in nonprofit. I used to work with formerly homeless and incarcerated people. So I knew a lot more about the criminal legal system. I was also a peacemaker with the Red Hook Community Justice Center. So I've had a lot of contact from the other side. And I know that, you know, really maintaining your rights is so important in
So
that time.
important.
And so after I got back to my mom's home, sure enough, investigators showed up and they wanted to talk to me and they wanted me to hand over my phone. And I said, "Well, you're going to need to get a search warrant and talk to my attorney." And they went and got a search warrant. They spoke to my attorney at the time. And when they came back with the warrant, it was my name with the words homicide on it. And they also, in addition to my phone, requested morphine from an e-kit. And part of me was relieved. I was like, okay, they're going to see it's a prescription and they're going to see it's barely used.
Yeah.
You're thinking that these are the things that
The
will.
common sense part is gonna kick in.
Right. And I'm just like, surely they're going to understand that there's either a misunderstanding, that someone was confused. And even though you're terrified, because you have not broken the law or killed anybody, like, I was called down because she was dying,
Yeah.
you sort of hold on to that hope. And so that was when I was first made aware. It was getting that call, after she died as expected and at the memory care facility. And I wanna pause there so we can you can kind of pick up with any questions.
No, no, no. Thank you. One, I didn't want to interrupt you because I truly believe that that's when you let someone talk, that's how we communicate everything that's happening. So when your mom was in her final hours, because that's what we're focusing on, the final hours, when were you the person who had to administer the medication?
Yes,
Because you talked about the DIY.
because it was not prescribed to the facility, and they're
Okay,
only authorized to administer what's prescribed to the facility.
got it.
So, yeah, at that point, it's family caregivers are it you know, memory care facilities are in a weird designation. I don't know if it's true of all states, but in Georgia, it's just considered a residence. It's still home hospice. She's essentially, a tenant paying rent, but you pay extra for all the services like nursing and activities of daily living, but it's essentially like per apartment. That's
Got it.
basically the legal designation. So you're still the person with power of attorney, you're still the family caregiver. Now, facilities will have certain rules about medications you can and can't bring in because of, other residents potentially getting their hands on. That's one reason we were very careful to have it not potentially fall into the hands of a resident. Um, but it's considered an emergency use medication, which is generally protected under the law. And they specify things like EpiPens, for instance. Like a family member, if your loved one's going into allergic shock, you can give your loved one an EpiPen. Um, and so that was my understanding of the law then too. But really, there's nothing that specifically governs um, family caregiver administration of controlled substances. It's sort of operated under the trust system, where families are trusted to use these medications responsibly and as prescribed. And as they're instructed by the individual hospice companies that may have protocols that vary a little from company to company. And family members, in turn, sort of trust that no one's going to, like, say, oh, I think there was improper morphine
Yeah.
use.
Yeah.
Um,
No, and so when you receive the training, do they train you on the end of life? Do they really break down? Well, one, I don't think anybody's ever prepared, like you said previously,
yeah.
on how the body breaks down, the lack of functionality, and
Hmm.
even knowing you have to really know your person well to know when
You
they're in
do.
pain and what's happening
You
to their
do.
body.
I wasn't trained very specifically on agonal breathing because the instruction that I received is you call hospice, you can describe the symptoms and you get further instruction,
Okay.
which was the protocol I followed, right? But I knew enough from hospice nurse friends and researching what the end of life would look like that I knew what the agonal breathing was at the very end when it's the heart. It's very dramatic looking. Um, if someone is already on palliative morphine, people may never see agonal breathing because palliative morphine can often calm that, but it is a desperate gasping for air
Yeah.
with the jaw, and it is extremely distressing. It looks like the person is drowning in their own bed. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I had a grandmother who had her trach removed incorrectly.
Oof.
And that is something that when people say you have to learn how to forgive, I'm like, no.
Mm,
Like there's some things I will never forgive because that is
mm.
something that a 8-year-old child should never see. But also a child, no one should have to deal with, not even the person who's going through that. And so that's why I asked that question because I truly believe that as a person, let me die with my dignity,
Yes.
right?
Not
And
gasping for air.
yes, right? Because the whole purpose of me having hospice care or home care, having the foresight to ask for assistance to make sure that my loved one is taken care of, that foresight is so that my loved one doesn't go through that.
That's
But
right.
not only is my loved one going through that, you now put the responsibility on me to figure out how to help in a medical way when that's not my degree. That's not
Right.
where I come from. And the lack of assistance that can come from that, not only is it traumatizing to be in the moment, but you also have to put that aside and say, okay, so what do I do next?
Yeah.
And then how do I understand and or protect myself from a system that is now attacking me when I just did what I was supposed to do, you
Right.
know? So when you say, okay, you now find yourself in the legal battle for your life because that's what it is. Let's
Well,
just
at that point, I'm just a suspect.
but you still are saying, I know what I loved about our initial conversation is you said something very important here. I'm educated enough to know when the chips are not falling correctly, right? I
Yeah.
am educated enough to know when the words don't sound right, when the energy is off. and that I need to start paying attention to every move that I
Yeah.
make.
Yes.
So, what are you now that you are having to prove you're you're having to change your mindset, like you said, I'm going from grief
Yep.
into survival mode
Yep.
instantaneously.
Yeah.
After contacting your attorney, having them come obtain your phone, serve the warrant, now what's your next step?
So my next step was to try and understand what on earth happened to my mom. So I had no context for how she had been found collapsed and doubled over. I knew that she had been hospitalized 2 days prior to a collapse because she stumbled and fell in her room.
Mhm,
But there were a lot of gaps in information. So one of my first moves was to find an attorney because I sent requests for medical records to her memory care, and those requests were unfortunately not responded even though I was legally entitled to those records under my power of attorney, which is still good for 6 months after death when you're obtaining medical records.
mhm.
Um, and of course, I had medical and I had durable power of attorney as well. So I sent a demand letter. And at that point, I get not only the memory care facilities records, but hospice records as well. And that enabled me not only to get context for how my mom was found, you know, what her condition was like when she was found, and the call that was made to me, and that she was declared actively dying and what her oxygen saturation was and who made that call. But I also saw that the hospice nurse had charted on the 11th, the day before my mom died, had charted that I requested euthanasia. I never made any such request. I requested morphine. And that was when alarm bells really went off
Mm,
because I had a suspicion that would probably be used as some sort of evidence if it were to ever come down to an indictment. And when a medical professional makes a claim like that, that carries a lot of weight,
yes, it
right?
does.
Um, now, that was really scary. But again, I knew that I had an abundance of evidence on my side that I had never made any such request. I knew it wasn't on my phone, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Wasn't in any because they do forensic analysis of your text messages and everything. And I was like, no, I had recorded conversations with that hospice nurse as well. While we were talking about my mom's care, because I was having concerns about the lack of morphine and I wanted to document these conversations.
Mhm.
And so I knew I had a lot of evidence showing that I did my best to ensure my mom received adequate comfort care, not trying to hasten her death.
Yes.
But I knew that I was in a precarious situation, especially as the investigation dragged on, until we got that death certificate not showing homicide, right? And that I was cleared. And while you're a suspect, you can't really move forward with the estate. You're not going to be able to move forward with things like life insurance either. There's the Slayer statute that comes into play. And if there's an active investigation and you're under investigation, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So you're sort of in this like state of in suspended animation because I couldn't even sort through my mom's things or even think about having an estate sale. I was so paralyzed because I wasn't even able to move through the appropriate stages of grief
Were
because
you
I was
allowed to leave the
still
state?
in survival mode. Oh yeah. Yes, I was just
Okay.
a suspect.
Okay. Okay.
Um so I was able to leave the state and I went on and tried my best as my attorney advised to live my life, right? Um and I did. And for over a year and a half,
Mhm.
there was nothing.
Mhm.
I was just a suspect
Mhm.
until uh, a few days before my birthday. I had made of this year. I made an Instagram post commemorating my mom, and an anonymous person commented on Instagram, "Why did you murder? Your shame on you for murdering your mom. This is why your family disowned you." And then they posted a very official looking indictment with the number, and it had two charges and my name, malice murder and felony murder. And in the state of Georgia, those are the most serious charges anyone can get. Malice murder is murder committed with an abandoned and malignant heart. Um, they are terrifying charges because they carry the weight of the possibility of the death penalty.
Mhm. And Georgia is a death penalty state.
It is indeed. And that is when I started questioning my own reality. I was like, is this even real? And is this an elaborate scam? Is someone trying to terrorize me? But in my deep down, I knew it was real.
Mhm.
And I sent the screenshot to my attorney and I said, tell me if this is real. And he said, yes, it is. There has been a warrant for your arrest for almost 2 weeks. You need to immediately make arrangements to turn yourself in,
Mhm.
and you need to get, the only man I would have defend me if my life were on the line, Brian Steele. And now I knew Brian Steele from the Young Thug case, and he's quite famous. And I said, there's no way he's going to take my case. And the attorney I'd been consulting with pro bono, he said, he will. I just talked to him on the phone.
Oh, wow.
And at that point, it was like this deus ex machina of, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the country sweeping in. And I was so grateful to have him in partnership with Pete Theodosian, who is a local attorney and really understood the system there well, who then immediately jumped into action to make arrangements for when the bond hearing would be and for me to turn myself in and for me to start getting together the evidence I had on my end in case for some reason I didn't make bond and would lose access to, my
Yes.
laptop and my phone. Um, but that's when the real terror sets in. I lost like 10 pounds in 4 days. I just stopped eating. I could not eat without feeling like I was going to throw up.
Yes.
And it was also just, sorry, it was just,
Shoot.
I'm going to have a sneeze fit. It was also just so unexpected because at that point it had gone on so long. The longer you go without charges, the less likely typically charges are to come.
Yes.
And life, you were subject to this cognitive normalcy bias where life is starting to feel kind of normal. And then it's so much worse than the moment you found out you were a suspect. It is the ultimate nightmare. You're really fighting for your life now. You don't know if when you turn yourself in, you're ever going to walk out of that cell. Because if you've had a lot of contact with the criminal legal system, either a nonprofit, you know that often people may spend years awaiting trial,
Yeah.
especially if they have a public defender. And I was fortunate enough to not have to rely on a public defender. But also, when the state charges you with something that serious, the odds that you will end up, um, you know, incarcerated or that you'll win against the state are infinitesimally small. Like it's 90+% odds. I think sometimes like 99% odds. Like whether through plea deal or through conviction, of course, most being through plea deal, you do not end up walking free.
Yeah.
And and you're also thinking like, God, is there like some crazy fabricated evidence out there? Like AI is a thing. Like your mind goes all different places. But I was very lucky in that we were able to make arrangements for me to turn myself in. I had to be driven to Georgia by my husband's because you cannot fly, you're a fugitive.
Yes, and that's what I was gonna ask you. So what was that even just even your drive down, what
Oh
did
my
that
God.
look like for your mental side?
You're just kind of you're dissolving, you're cycling through all the things, you're crying, you're hiding in the back seat, hoping you don't get pulled over by law enforcement. I sure as hell didn't want to end up at like Rikers here. So I
Yeah.
was like, I hope NYPD doesn't, because there's a warrant, it's everywhere.
Yeah, no, and
Everyone
I know
knows,
yeah.
you're essentially on the lam. It's not like you get a courtesy call like, hey, you've been indicted.
And that's what I mean too. So you have this gap of 2.5 weeks of not knowing that you are
Oh, yeah.
fighting for your life. So that
Yeah.
could have been anything from a fender bender, a ticket.
Exactly. In fact, I had just flown back from Georgia the day before my indictment was issued. I was down there and it was an emergency flight home. I was down there working on my mom's home because I was doing home repairs and trying to fix it up in, honor of her wishes. And we had to come home early because our cat got really sick. And so I took an early flight home. If I had not taken that early flight home, I would have been arrested in Augusta, Georgia at TSA.
Do you think that was purposeful? The
It
charges coming
it
after you leaving?
I it certainly felt like kismet, and I will tell people that my cat, who nearly died, of cancer, he's like my hero. I'm like, "You saved my life, Chicharron. I'm gonna paint a portrait in your honor." Um, because it did feel, I am, uh I am a Buddhist and I am a pretty spiritual person and I'm hesitant to describe things as divine intervention, but my God, did it feel like it.
Yeah.
I've often said I am the world's most lucky and most unlucky person you'll ever meet. It is never an in between. It is always a really wild swing. And Brian Steele being an example of that, right?
Yes.
Like, no
Yes.
one gets him. I am not a millionaire. None of us are.
Yeah.
Um, but we had just enough to be able to fight for my life. And subsequently, we had just enough where when the bond hearing came up, I had spent 12 hours in jail total. You know, I'm sitting there in my little orange jumpsuit on camera. You don't attend bond hearings in person in Columbia County. Uh, the DA, I was very fortunate. The DA who she was not the one who originally brought the case. She was an interim DA who had come on while the previous DA had been called to service in DC. So it
Okay.
was the lead investigator who had presented my case to the grand jury. So the DA had done a little more digging and said herself that this didn't appear to be anything done in malice. And she was, said, well, if she did it, and there seemed to be some telegraphing of doubt about the charges.
Okay.
And that was when I felt a little bit of hope, especially, I had a huge turnout in the courtroom for me. I'm still humbled by it to this day. Like dozens of friends, they traveled from all over to show up for me at that bond hearing and to speak for me. And to say, like, look, this is not a person who's going to run. Like she will face whatever you throw
Yeah.
at her, and she is ready to face it. Um, And I was really fortunate that the judge granted me $200,000 bond. Um, and that we were, you know, able to draw from retirement and savings and everything else to pay that in addition to legal fees. But being released on bond and able to return home really enabled me to collect all of the evidence I
Yes.
had in the days leading up to my mom's death. And that was where I realized how much these various levels of privilege had come into play with saving my own life and how close to the knife's edge I was of still sitting in that jail cell because everything had to go perfectly in order for me to even be in a position to demonstrate like I didn't kill my mom.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and luckily I was able to gather that evidence and you know even though it's really scary to go and it's traumatizing frankly because the criminal legal system is meant to dehumanize you
Absolutely.
and each layer strips away another layer of your identity. And I met and talked to people in there who had been there for years, and there was a lot of just devastation from just I felt so much guilt when I walked out of that cell, knowing how many people were still waiting because they couldn't make $1,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, the majority of people who are incarcerated in this country are incarcerated in jails, in pretrial detention,
Yeah.
rather than in prison. And that haunted me on a completely different level and added a whole new layer to my grief and to my horror. But it is the thing that sparked the, oh my God, when I get through this, I have to do everything in my power to ensure this never happens to another person again, because they will not have my savings. They will not have a connected attorney. They
Yes.
will not have the legal knowledge and wherewithal to start collecting evidence. They won't have those things. And they will either end up with a plea deal potentially or facing trial, because it's a terrifying thing to face a murder trial. And a lot of people understandably will take a plea deal, especially if they don't have a good defense. Because if you're not planning to commit a murder, know,
You don't have a defense set up
you
in the
don't
bank.
typically have a defense. And for me, I was like documenting things because I was like, she's not getting appropriate medication. I need to start recording this, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Um, and it was just by chance that, I had started to really think about how I might need to defend myself if charges came down, that I was able to collect even more evidence.
So a few questions.
Hmm.
One, the person who posted the warrant, I mean, you still don't know who that person is?
Well, I will probably never know. Yeah, they just created an anonymous. I can't even speculate on who it was. Like people threw out all kinds of things, or like maybe it was someone on the grand jury or someone who knew somebody, or because we couldn't find the info online.
Yeah, and
But
that's what I was gonna say. That's not information that's just out there. You
it's
have to
not.
be an attorney. You have to request those things and the legalities of having access to that and then being able
I
to.
will not know. Yeah, they had a very generic name. It was like something like red-haired grandma, one something 80. It was like very no
But that
profile
really
photo,
gave you
nothing.
that gave you a chance to set up, right? Like,
Yes, it did.
it's
I said, thank God for
terrifying.
that person.
Yes,
Like they were an awful person posting that, but they
absolutely.
kind of saved my life.
Yeah,
So
because now because imagine 4 months now. So now you're on the run when that's not even the case.
you don't even know you're on the run. Well, in fact, like I was technically, a fugitive and didn't even know it. I'd been sitting in my apartment in Sunnyside, and I'd had like contact with law enforcement, with NYPD. You're just not even thinking about it. Like
Yeah.
they, like come to the apartment for an emergency or whatever, and they need to talk to people. Even earlier that year, my God, my husband and I, like, we came up on a crime scene outside our building. We ended up cleaning up the blood from it. A guy was stabbed on the doorstep, and we talked to the NYPD about it. And so it's just like it's so removed from everything that was going on in Georgia. The idea that at any point that indictment could have come through and they could have
Yeah.
just looked at me and been like, "Hey, that's that pink-haired woman that was charged with murder," you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So what does it okay, so now you have the evidence that you need, you have the attorney that you need, which fell in your lap based off of your preliminary work for
Right.
with your pro bono attorney having the contact. What does the legal advocacy look like for you from your main attorney? And you were never you never went to trial, correct?
No.
Okay.
I was lucky to not go to trial simply because, and I think a big reason is because we had so much evidence that provided additional context that was not available or provided before, and we're not quite sure which that is. So we got discovery early in, and we very quickly realized with the discovery that, you know, hospice allegations were that I was trying to hasten my mom's death, that I wanted to get rid of my mom. But there was really, we never saw any context around, we didn't see anything with regards to active dying. We didn't see much, any conversation about cancer. And so it quickly became clear to us that there was a lot of missing context, that
Mhm.
the medical examiner, we had no idea whether or not he had access to it. It certainly seemed the investigators didn't have access to her medical records. And so our strategy, Brian was very straightforward. He was like, well, we can give them context and see what they say, because we do have this context. And it took a while because it is extremely slow going when you're
Legal
dealing
is
with
always slow.
bureaucracy, right?
Mhm.
But our approach and we were lucky because the DA was quite a reasonable person as well too. And she'd already pulled my mom's and my financial records, and she saw like that I didn't kill my mom for money or any kind of gain, right? She'd spoken to my family who had not spoken to me, who had cut contact with me after my mom's death, but they gave her additional context about my mom's incredible amount of pain.
Mhm.
And, you know, if you're talking about morphine and pain relief, it's like, well, it raises doubts of, mercy killing
Yeah.
or pain relief. And a lot of people I think who are well-meaning online, they started imagining it as a mercy killing. And here I am, like with my medical knowledge, going, my God, you've never overdosed someone with morphine. That's a horrible way to die, right?
Yeah.
That's me being very pedantic, but also like my mom didn't want to commit suicide in her right mind,
Yeah.
even though she had been suicidal due to pain. And that's just, I am not, I am not in a position to do that. My mom is actively naturally dying. I am, however, in a position to provide comfort care.
Yes.
And so we wanted to make it very clear that that was always the intent of my actions. And so we had a ton of text messages and a ton of Google searches, and we had the medical records, and we had recordings of my conversation with hospice as well as recordings of my mom as she was dying.
Mhm.
Um, because we wanted to document the state she was in, in a bid to see if, like, hey, it looks like morphine probably is appropriate, right? Like her
Yeah.
eyes are drying out,
Yeah.
she can't even blink.
Yeah.
Um, and when we provided that additional context to the medical examiner, he changed the cause of death. And it was no longer a homicide at that point. Because one of the things about morphine redistribution in the body that we know is that is highly dependent on the context in which someone dies.
Mhm.
Are they eating? Are they drinking? Are they urinating? Are they defecating? And depending on the days leading up to a person's death, it can impact the post-mortem concentration, as can the time between when the body is collected, as well as like the days after when the autopsy is performed. And we will never know the exact thing that prompted him to reevaluate the case. We only know that he did, and he took a great deal of time and thoughtfulness in doing it, and then changed that cause of death. So it was no longer a homicide. And at that point, the DA, you cannot have a murder trial really without a murder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and the DA dropped it immediately, didn't even drag her feet at all, and it was as simple as a phone call. It was such a strange and surreal moment in August, where my attorney just called me and said, "Great news, she's entered a nolle prosequi, all the charges dropped, case is about to be dismissed, and that will terminate our services, thank you very much." It's like,
Go have a donut. What?
"Uh"
What?
And all you can think is, well, I've lost my job, my career. My
Reputation.
face is on newspapers with headlines saying woman murdered her mom with lethal dose of morphine. The internet in that community especially is abuzz with like, is she or isn't she a killer? Did it for money, or your reputation is shot. You have lost your family.
Yes.
You your life as you knew it has been obliterated. I was lucky that I held on to my community and my relationships because all my life I am a community builder and a community person, and those proved to be very resilient, and thank God for that. I am so grateful. And that's really one of the things that's kept me going, but it's also what gave me the strength to say, "Okay, what now?" Because
What now?
returning to that life before, that is not an option. Everything has been changed.
Yes.
And this could impact anybody. Literally, if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone, but the circumstance, the outcome rather, would probably be very different if it did.
So how do
And
we turn that pain into purpose?
that's right.
How do we turn that pain into purpose? And since the system failed you and you didn't fail yourself, which is wonderful because you knew how to advocate for yourself, which is so hard for a lot of people,
It
which
is.
kind of takes us back to your grandmother letting you be you and your mother
Yeah.
letting you be you, right? So you have these great women who are on either side of you, kind of like lifting you up and walking with you so that you are not by yourself.
No.
So how do you say at what point, and you said August, was it August of 2024 or August of
It
20?
was August 2025.
Okay. Okay, baby. Let's really talk about that because how do you say, okay, not only did we have the moment, you had that year and a half of grieving and trying to go back to normalcy, and then you have now 6 months of intense life, kind of life, death. Do I go back to normal? How do I advocate for myself? What does the legal system look
Oh,
like
I go on
for me?
trial. Yeah.
Do I go to trial? Am I gonna be able to stay in my home? What about my marriage?
Yeah.
What about my spouses?
Right.
What about my job? How do I make a living? And
Yeah.
at what point after you receive the call do you think to yourself, shit, how many people are like going through this right now, like me? And how do I take this pent
Oh.
up energy and flip it?
I had been thinking that all throughout that 6 months, and I had been digging up cases of people who had been falsely not only, charged, but, people who had ended up even there was one guy who was sort of posthumously exonerated in Texas for an arson fire that killed his children, and later they determined he was not a murderer, but he was executed. And I started following stories of like parents whose kids had gotten hit by a car in North Carolina and they took a plea deal and now they're felons for life because they couldn't pay bond and they lost a child. And I realized, hospice or not, like these these failures of the system happen way more often than they should. And it is even rarer that someone is able to triumph in that system and, have their freedom at the end of the day or, um, you know, not go to trial. Although there was a part of me that I think, going to trial, it's like, oh, you get to lay it all out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but you still don't want to go to
I
trial
was
in
gonna
general
say
if you're
you
gonna
don't
win, 'cause
you
then
don't
you're at the mercy.
yes.
Yeah, but I had thought about those people a lot, but mostly I thought about what happens if someone has a loved one in hospice and uh it could be a healthcare provider, it can be a family member even who thinks, "Oh, I don't like the way they're using morphine or I don't trust them." And people like families tend to get really dicey often as people are dying. And I wondered what if this person is accused? What is there to protect them? Because when you're prescribed e-kits, no one's going in and measuring the amount of medication that's left or comparing it against what you say you're giving. That's not documented anywhere. And one of the things I thought immediately when I went on bond was researching the gaps in the law
Mhm.
and what would need to change in order to provide essentially three-way protection? Protection for family caregivers who are responsible for administering medications, protection for dying loved ones who deserve comfort care, and you don't want family
Absolutely.
members to be afraid to give them
Mhm.
medication, but also protection for hospice providers. So, if there is malfeasance and a family member has dumped a bottle of morphine down someone's throat, them saying, hey, the morphine was at this level when we checked it last, and now it's zilch. And
Yes.
you want to be able to have really clear documentation of those things so everything's transparent and on the up and up. And there were no laws governing that. And so my thought was if someone had been measuring the medications that I had been prescribed from my mom and my administration of them, what I said I administered, they would find there had been no abuse of the medication. They would have found that there was no overdose or even attempt at an overdose.
No,
And
absolutely.
it would have prevented it from happening to me. And it certainly needed to be in place to prevent from happening to someone else because someone else just wasn't going to have the abundance of evidence that I had necessarily. Um, and so, yeah, I think that was, I had really started thinking about it even before. And I knew the moment that I was cleared, that the charges were dropped, the first thing I needed to do was raise awareness that this is a thing that can happen. And B, here's one way we can prevent that. But also, until we can prevent that, document everything. Be meticulous and on top of it. But I still don't want people to be afraid to provide comfort care for their loved ones. And so, really it's raising that flag so people know if it could happen to me, it could happen to them.
No, and a couple of things came to mind as you were talking. Number one, I love that you spoke about just the measurements, right? Because when you're in the hospital and they have the drip and you have to click and it's only a certain amount of
Yeah.
you can have, which then counts the medication. So
Right.
even the the system that's set up is again the gap in accountability, or even having to scan the document and having software that counts the amount of times it's scanned to
Right.
be able to match it. That's number one. But not but the main thing is, how would you have not or known that, right? As a person who's trained, your mind says, oh, somebody must know
Yeah.
what I'm doing.
Yes.
Do I keep record of this?
Right.
And but what if you aren't meticulous? What if you feel like you're at your wits end and you are a
Yeah.
person who is just being pulled? You're a mom of three,
Oh,
or
yeah.
you're
And
the
people with loved ones in home hospice are usually at wit's end.
yes, yes, yes. And how do you say, okay, like, now that I know, you now know the system, you've walked the system, which nobody wants to be the mortar, but now you've walked the system, right? And you say, okay, now not only am I rebuilding myself, reclaiming who I am, but there are people I want to take with me so that you know exactly what this looks like.
That's
You
right.
know what it looks like to be a caregiver from the time you received the notice that your mom was suffering from Alzheimer's to the time you found out that she had cancer. You've walked the walk with family members who were taking care of her, you taking care of her, the care that your spouses were taking care of.
Yeah.
You have
And
all
the
of this,
caregivers we hired, I
right?
mean,
So you have all of this knowledge that you have where you can say, okay, this is how we can advocate for ourselves and protect ourselves, not only as caregivers, but you're looking out for the facilities
yeah,
and people's careers, right? Because
yes.
what if you weren't the person who gave the morphine? What if it would have been a nurse,
Right.
right? And
Yeah,
was she also?
yeah, that's why documentation is so important and knowing, you know, it is not enough to just be given this kit and then, advised on its use and then okay, well, you call, especially if people move or people transition. There's just not a lot of, transition to different facilities. There's not a ton of guidance because home hospice doesn't change when they move into a facility. Sometimes rules around it can change, but the law, it's their house
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
Um, and you're in this bizarre gray area where it may be even that the people in the facility don't even know the legal designation or the difference between what's
Mhm.
a law or a
Mhm.
facility rule,
Mhm.
right? Um, and so that was part of the reason, when I found that I was a suspect, my assumption was just like, oh, maybe they thought that because they didn't have it at the facility, it was illegal morphine,
Yeah.
even though I had declared it. And so it's sort of giving that the benefit of the doubt. You know, I I think that it's really hard. And one of the things that I don't want to do is ascribe intent. All I, can say though is what we have on record, which is that, statements were made that were factually incorrect.
Mhm.
And I was able to present evidence demonstrating that those were likely to be factually incorrect, right?
Mhm.
Um, and again, you don't have a play by play camera of every single thing that's happened. There's no such thing as like this perfect truth. But you hope that in good faith that people will work toward their best understanding of the truth. And we were very grateful that when we presented new evidence that both the DA and the medical examiner did. But someone else in this situation, they may not have a medical examiner who's willing to re-examine or look at new evidence. They may not have, a DA who's this understanding. God forbid they may have a pre-existing criminal record, that places them at a great disadvantage already in the system. You know, I was lucky because I also had a strong public reputation.
Yes.
And that counts for a lot too, and I am a white woman, and as weird as I am, with 2 partners and pink hair, which
It's
granted, it's
very boring still. Like, we keep talking
still,
about this, like, it's
you
so
know,
boring.
it's still it's so normal even though it draws attention, knowing that with all my privileges that I still ended up in the position of being
Mhm.
charged, you really are floored by how someone you take away just 1 layer of privilege and they could end up in a nightmare, and that is just not anything I could ever live with myself. Like if I didn't speak out, if that happened to someone else, like and it's maybe very rare, but and you may never hear about if someone's taken a plea deal, but the
Yeah.
idea that there is somebody out there who might be serving time because they had a loved one in home hospice and there was an allegation that they abused morphine, my God, if
Yeah.
I can do anything to prevent that, then that's the way I honor my mom's legacy and what she suffered and what I suffered after her death.
And I think that that for me was what really drew me to your story after learning about it. It was your need to uplift your mom's legacy, her spirit. She didn't pass away for this to be the legacy that was left behind with her name, right? And I think that then leads us into how are you healing? Because we were talking about off camera just the anger or bitterness that you could have carried, right?
Yeah.
And what it looks like for PTSD, because there's no way you're making it out of this without
No,
having some
no, I
issues.
definitely have PTSD.
You know what I mean? But what does it look like for you to
Mm.
a as an advocate, you have to really do a lot of work on yourself so that you don't keep putting yourself in other people's shoes. You have to really work on yourself so that you can hear other people's story and not keep hearing your story. So what
Yes.
does healing look like for you as you're moving through such a new space right now?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think it's sort of multifactorial. Like one part of it is I have to remind myself that this is the good part of the story, the part of the story in which I have some agency to make something truly meaningful happen and to make that grief amount to something that there's this forward progression that is not just this tragic arc that it could have been. And that fills me with so much hope. Having conversations like this, being able to talk to my friends who are hospice nurses and lawyers when I'm crafting, these early drafts of the legislation I would want passed to become Marcia's law eventually. Um, that's healing. I'm a huge gym rat, honestly, and working out, lifting heavy, taking care of my body. That has helped me a lot too, because when you're a caregiver, all those things fall into disrepair. You know, you, I, the week after my mom died, I had major surgery, and I was kind of down and out, and it was just kind of piled on, right? Um, Physically, emotionally, everything about you is worn down. And I realized I needed to rebuild myself physically. I needed to rebuild my sense of hope. I needed to lean into all the gratitude I felt for the community that rallied behind me. And I needed to take the anger I felt that this had happened to my mom and then to me and channel that power and that energy into, you know, making it clear that this is a thing that can happen for other people, but there is hope yet if we can get legislation passed or a law passed that can help protect people. And that is kind of everything, honestly. And plus, like, I finally was able to access life insurance so I can afford therapy now.
Which is so I
It's
love how
huge.
when you talked about, and even when you said earlier, you were talking about, we were kind of having a conversation where it was like people, when the assumption was I was going to get this life insurance money, I was going to get this all encompassing, changing, life changing money, and this is why I would have done something like this. Where if you had to give up your retirement, your job, your full life,
Oh,
your
yeah.
spouses are trying to come together,
Oh, yeah.
like financial ruin, to then receive the life insurance,
Right.
right? But there's still so much damage control that has to happen
Yeah.
after giving up so much. On top of the fact I lost my mom. Like at the end of the day, I still lost my mom
Yeah.
and I have to deal with that.
Yeah.
But I also lost a part of who I was because that pre-life, that pre knock on the door, that life is never coming back. I don't even know who
No.
she is anymore.
No.
Right. And so the advocacy work
Exactly.
that you want to do, the laws that you want to have enacted, really are just policies to help people bridge the gap between the caregiver,
Yeah.
the patient, and the facilities so that we all have the same information coming in at the same time.
Right. Right. Um, and I think that at that point where you go with it, it, whether I were to choose to work in nonprofit again or go back to the career I had, I feel a really strong duty to myself and my mom to see this part through first. And again, we're talking about privilege because one of the things people have said to me, Rachel, you don't have to relive your worst trauma, you know, over and over again. Like, I just want to tell you, you don't have to. And I said, no, I do. I appreciate what you're saying, but I do. You know why? Because I have a husband that can support me and I have enough life insurance that I can afford to go public with this. I have a strong enough reputation that I can afford to let the world know that I was charged with murder and be willing to face the criticisms that come with that because there will always be. And I have a communications background. I have experienced the criminal legal system. I have a medical background. I am exactly the right person that something this horrible should have happened to. And I'm exactly the right person to speak out about it. Because if not me, who? And that is the thing that like really drives me through this and reminding myself like with great it's like with great power comes great responsibility,
Responsibility.
with great privilege comes great responsibility too. You better use that.
Yes. And
um
you gave me goosies because I was like, she just needs a podium right now. Like she just needs a podium right now. Because I think that what you're really describing is what it looks like to be an ally for the patient, right? Because yes, you went through it, but this is a situation where nobody really wins.
no.
Nobody wins, right? I mean, yes, you have your freedom, but it's a very different life now.
Yes.
It's a very different life. And the fact that you are self-aware enough to know like, okay, yes, I could ignore this. I could just go on with my life. I could shut everything down and kind of move on because the privilege gives me that right to do so. But it's still not going to heal the system. It's still not going to fix what was wrong with me. It's still not going to fix the next Rachel who goes through this because the next Rachel is already going through this right now and they don't know they have rights or that there is a possibility to have a pro bono attorney. Like some people don't speak that language at all.
Yes, they don't.
You
That
know,
is
so
true.
that's what I really just have endeared about you. It's the fact that not only are you taking your strengths, but you're taking that tragedy and that vulnerability and your raw feelings and turn it into advocacy and compassion for not just yourself, because I'm so happy that when you talk about yourself, your self-esteem is still there. Because a lot of people lose that.
Well, that's that you can thank my mama for that.
We thank mama and grandma because you
And my
had
oh, my grandparents both. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, absolutely. I come from a long line of really strong women, so
and that's beautiful. When you think about your mom now, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
the first thing that comes to mind when I think about my mom is I think about the joy for life that she retained even as dementia started to steal her mind. And I intend to honor that joy in every way that I can. Um, yeah, I think about the last conversation I had with her before she was found non-responsive, and it was at the end of June, and we went and we sat in the courtyard of her memory care facility, and she reached out and we held hands. My mom and I, we always had this like love language where we'd squeeze twice, love me, and then squeeze back, I do, how much, and then we'd squeeze together. And I did it, and she remembered it, which she hadn't for like over a year, and she squeezed back. And then she looked at the sky and she said, "Look at the light. I would love to paint that one day." And she was in so much pain and doubled over, and her mind was being stolen by dementia, and yet she was still dreaming of the art she could create and taking in the beauty of the world and cherishing this moment with me. And again, it was my mom again. That was my mom. And I live every day of my life fighting to honor that. And I always will, because the last thing my mom would ever want for me is to succumb to bitterness or despair or hatred. I am just, she wasn't wired that way. I'm not wired that way, but it would be such a disservice to her too. Um, and, who are we if not in service to those who've loved and nurtured us? That is, what we're put on this earth to do.
Absolutely. And in closing, what do you want this people to really take away from this podcast? And also, what are you doing? What are your next steps? How are you
Yeah.
moving forward? Because you
So
are living and you're moving forward, and we're gonna watch some wonderful things come from you.
I am. What I want people to take away from is A, this could potentially happen to you, but not all hope is lost. You should meticulously document everything. Get to know your state's laws about, is it a two-party state if you're recording a conversation? Is there a difference between, recording verbal conversations, just audio versus video?
Mm.
And get to know that. Start documenting things if something feels a little bit off. Advocate for your loved ones. Get to know some of the laws around, you know, the facilities that your loved ones are in or the care, and really stand up and fight for the person you love, but be really thoughtful in your documentation and try to not be afraid, because at the end of the day, providing that care for our loved ones, especially, if we're the chosen family caregiver or we're the power of attorney, it is still our obligation. And so I don't want people to come away feeling afraid. I want people to come away feeling prepared should
Mhm.
they face that situation. And hopefully, we can shore up legal protections to provide an additional layer as well. And for me, my next steps are, in addition to, raising more awareness about how this can happen to people, is making connections with lawmakers, right? And
Right.
further refining this law. I mean, this is such a strange political environment to be in when you're talking about something you want to be a bipartisan law, and finding what the best strategy is. Do you go state by state, or do you go like straight ahead to sort of lobbying at the federal level and really determining what the best next steps are? That's the phase that I'm in now. So it's sort of this: raise awareness, get people familiar with it, and now at least come to lawmakers to say, hey, this number of people are, rely on home hospice care. These are your constituents and they are vulnerable. And this is a thing that could help save a lot of misery and cost to the state too, right? It's not like it was free for the state to charge me with murder, you
Yes.
know?
So
Um,
correct. Such a good point to make.
so, that is a situation where everyone potentially can win. And to pitch that, I don't even know if there's such a thing as bipartisan anymore. But my God, I would hope that it could be at least that we could all agree that people should not be left to suffer in agony at end of life, and loved ones should not fear murder charges for caring for loved ones at end of life.
I couldn't agree more. And just to add to that, especially with the growing number of boomers who are now moving into adult care, who are now moving into hospice, is at a record amount of people going into spaces where they are now where their children are now having to advocate for them, fighting for them, not understanding the laws that are out there, depending on the state, if there are even laws, or if they're even in a state where you are allowed to help with the end of life, because
Yeah,
there's some states where that's just not going to happen.
right.
So just having someone like you having the courage and the heart to speak up and realize that your voice matters is so huge. And I don't want you to get lost in the everyday of it all and forget that your soul is what's fighting. Like, you are such a phenomenal woman and you are fighting for the greater good, not just of your mom's name, but really putting a mark in a space where you could have just let bitterness step in, and you didn't do that. You said, you know what? Today is not going to be the day. Today is not going to be the day, because I have, like you said, I get to live. And in that means that I get to speak out on so many different, because you aren't just going to speak out on caregivers. You're going to create just a new way of us fighting for the people that we love and giving people permission to die with dignity. And that makes such a huge difference in this world. And I thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to me and being vulnerable and honest and open, because a lot of times we let the bitterness dictate the conversation, and it has been such a pleasure speaking with you. I just appreciate you so much, and I can't wait to hear about the changes that you're going to make, because you're going to make big changes, Miss Rachel. I already
I am I it feels like I'm climbing Mount Everest, or I am overwhelmed, but man, I have a will, a very strong will, and that can get you pretty far. So I'm hopeful, and thank you for the vote of confidence, because that is part of the fuel, right? Is to know other people support that and are, you know, behind that fight too. It means the world to me, and thank you so much for listening to my story and giving me this opportunity.
You are so welcome. We will see you in the future. I already know.
Bye bye.
Guys, how did you feel listening to this podcast? I just want to thank Rachel so much for her courage and her heart and her ability to understand that her voice can help change lives, and that her story is going to save more lives than she ever knows. And that as a caregiver and a daughter and a fighter, that she is valued and she is not alone in this fight, because, as stated in the podcast, there's so many of us whose parents are now going into a different phase of their lives where we'll have to be caregivers, where we're going to be the people who are making decisions for them, understanding the legal ramifications, what it looks like to have a durable power of attorney, your limited power of attorney, your medical power of attorney, your will, knowing that the logistics of the legal system is still very different than the logistics of the medical system. And learning how to maneuver through those spaces in a way that helps you not only advocate for yourself, but it helps you advocate for the people that you love. You guys know that I am so big on advocating. And if this episode moved you in Anyway, I want you to share it with someone who needs to know that they're not alone, right? That there are people out here fighting for their rights, fighting for their causes, who are going through the same thing that they're going through, that are still trying to find themselves after going through such a devastating loss, their mom, then the possibility of losing their freedom, then the possibility of just putting yourself in front of the firing squad and still accepting the calling. I think when we're talking about divine intervention, sometimes it looks like real people stepping up with real problems and finding real solutions. And I thank you so much for following the Healing Through Conversations podcast. We're streaming on all major platforms. And until next time, I'm your host, Loveli. I hope to see you guys soon. Bye, guys.
This ain't your average healing chat. It's healing through conversations with me, Love Lee Brown. Real talk, deep healing, zero fluff.